We have talked about how video games have been adapted for television, movies, comics, and novels with varying degrees of success. Earlier this year, Wyatt from Sprites and Dice guest hosted an episode talking about how Dungeons & Dragons influenced, and continues to influence, video games today. But what about the other way around? How do video games translate and inspire tabletop and board games today? On this episode, we take a look at how this comes full circle, so listen in as we talk about the translation of video games to the gaming table on our season finale of downloadable content next. Hello everyone, welcome to Downloadable Content. I am Brian, and with me we have Wyatt.
Hello.
And we have Reid. Welcome back.
Salutations. Good to be back.
You live.
I do. It's been a while.
It has. You were on earlier this year, but that seems like so long ago.
2016 has been a very long year, so...
in more ways than one.
Yeah, I don't think I've seen Reid except for during my birthday party in the city. Which, I mean, that was a good thing to be sure, but yeah.
Yeah, just for statistical references, Reid, the last time you were on downloadable content, you have to go 4,000 years ago to this year's PAX. So,
Oh, wow, yeah. That was, that was a while ago. Hard to think that we're already in, like, PAX mindset for next year.
Yeah.
PAX.
It seems like, with all of the bad shit that 2016 has had, April just seems so long.
It does. It feels like a year ago.
Yeah, so... But we're not talking about PAX today. We're going to be talking about video games and the translation of them to board games. But before we dive...
Things you can find at PAX.
Yes! In great abundance. Nice little segue there. But before we get into the discussion at hand, just want to remind everyone out there that every single episode of downloadable content can be found on our website, dlcpodcast.com. Every single episode is there. They're also on iTunes, YouTube, and Stitcher. You can check out the website, check out upcoming episodes. I'll be putting up the opening slate of 2017 recordings probably around January or so. After this episode, we take a break until the end of January, where we pick up again, and we'll start Season 7, our 7th year recording downloadable content. And I'm at 7 years, good God. So it's all there, www.dlcpodcast.com. This is episode number 123 of downloadable content, just for the record. So
I just recorded my 4th one, and I feel excited about that.
You have a long way to go.
I do. Hopefully we'll get there, but...
Sprites and Dice is such a baby podcast.
It's going to start teething soon. But
come on now.
It's fun, though. All right. So, as I said in the intro, we've talked about on downloadable content in the past how video games have translated to other forms of media with varying degrees of success. They seem to work well in comics and hit or miss, really, with movies and television. But now, we talked
more miss than hit, I'd say.
Yeah. With a few major commercial outliers like Resident Evil, which, it shouldn't even be called that because it bears no relation to the actual game. But anyway.
But tell us how you really feel.
If we do, we'll be here 3 hours. I could probably go with a bullet-by-bullet list of the Resident Evil movies. Like, no, wrong.
You're such a purist.
Tune in to the future special edition episode of Downloadable Content.
Brian yelling at his Resident Evil
movies.
3 hours.
Yeah, like an old man shakes fist at cloud. It's basically that'd be me. You should have been here on the What the Fuck Nintendo episode where it was just Ron and I going for about 2 hours just blasting Nintendo for all they were worth. But no,
Mario run this out.
Yes. So we are going to talk about the translation of video games to tabletop because I don't know if it's just because of our mutual circle of friends or otherwise, but it seems to me that board games are really, really starting to explode in popularity. I mean, I wasn't really much of a tabletop gamer until, say, within the last 3 or 4 years.
Sorry about that.
Yeah, you're partially to blame for that, I know. But, until maybe 3 or 4 years ago, my collection of board games really consisted of the classics: Monopoly, Life, Clue, Scrabble. All of which I still love. But
yeah, how many boxes of Monopoly do you now have?
12 or 13 now, I think. So I mean, but here's the thing. Even though I love Monopoly so dearly, no one will play it with me. Like, they're all afraid of it. But anyway. But now we see I see board games. Barnes and Noble, for crying out loud. I'm convinced that
absolutely
its gaming section at B&N seems to grow every single time I step in there.
I mean, here's the thing. Board games have been actually growing for quite some time. One reason why we started Sprites and Dice the way we did is that we saw a hole that needed to be filled because there was a lot of really big video gaming websites about, articles or otherwise or blogs. Board games were a little bit quieter. We started to see it with the Dice Towers podcast. Were kind of the first thing that started. There's also BoardGameGeek.com, which is, I believe, it's run on a donation site, and it's not as technically savvy because board gamers didn't really care about having this big online presence. So board games have been growing in size for a while. They never kind of went out of style in Germany. Germany brought them back with Catan. And then we started to see it really pick up around 2010 or 11, I'm going to say. At least that's when I really started getting invested. And that's when I saw it starting to pick up every year. People in the board game industry started saying that in 2013 or 14 that this is the age of board games, or the return of board games was starting. And now, yes, we have Barnes and Noble carries board games, and they're becoming more and more prominent. We have bars. This is more common on the West Coast, actually. There is a famous bar called the AFK Tavern, where there's bars where they have really, really nice board games. And you can drink and play board games, and it's entirely socially acceptable. It's something that started that way over in Europe because they don't have dedicated board game friendly local gaming stores like they do here in the US. So we're starting to see that happen. So board games have now really started to capture the imagination in the way where it's no longer just a niche group that says, hey, I've got a nice collection. Do you want to come over and play? We're starting to see it in public now, which is really cool.
And
certainly.
And you just said the West Coast. When I went to Seattle a couple of years ago, I was taken to a board game bar called Cafe Mox in the suburbs of Seattle, and it was exactly that. You had a board game store which was attached to a bar/restaurant, and there were these rooms that you have privacy, but you had full restaurant and bar service while you're at a gaming table with 4, 6, 8 buddies just playing card games. And I was just blown away by this. It was absolutely wonderful, and I wanted to airlift the entire thing over to New York. Just wanted to commandeer.
Well, I think it's interesting. Oops, sorry.
Yeah, go on, Reid. I'm done.
I was just going to say, I think it's interesting with the, as we were saying, the board games have really blown up in just the more recent years. I think they're sort of the evolution of gamers in the more traditional tabletop gaming field that are discovering board games as a self-contained, often quicker option to get a decent gaming session with your friends. I mean, I started off, my board gaming experience was really more years ago with classic Battletech, which is somewhere in that weird in-between of board game and tabletop, because you could get the box with these, I'm talking old school little paper cutouts of your mechs, your figures basically, on this hexagonal pre-made map, and these kind of character sheets of what areas of your mech could have damage. And the idea was that you could it was more like a toolbox. You could either play these long campaigns and put a lot of life into your individual mechs and even go out and get miniatures, or you could just throw down, use pre-made mechs, throw down the map, set up a pre-designed scenario and go at it. And to go from something like that as an old example, you started having a lot of people that were into the Warhammer, the collectible, have tons and tons of minis, that suddenly learned that, hey, there's this option out there for, a self-contained, I don't have to bring $1,000 worth of breakable minis with me and boxes and boxes of all this material. I can open this one box, put a few things down, and have a really awesome gaming session. Like, you look at the amount of things you need to carry for, War Machines, Warhammer, Malifaux, the expanded people that actually have like the full mini range and stuff for Battletech, compared to the package for Super Dungeon Explorer being a good example, as a relatively in-depth, fun situation where really you can run it all out of one single box for multiple players. So that compactability, that slimmed down aspect, I think has become a big allure, especially and kind of getting in that middle ground of video games where people are like, hey, I can have my Xbox set up and I can try connecting to the network to play a round of Destiny or something with Wyatt all the way over in half an hour away from me. Or if people are getting together, we can throw down and have like an episode turn game throwdown of the tabletop board game version of whatever we just found.
I know we're kind of having I'm not sure if this is quite off topic, but I think it's good that we're trying to situate where board games are. And honestly, just this upcoming Monday, like the middle of December, we're releasing my third podcast, which is about board games specifically. And we spend about 45 minutes of it trying to pin down where board games land. And the reason why is we realized in the middle that board games are a sweet spot. You have tabletop games like Dungeons and Dragons, and then you have the big war games like Malifaux or Warhammer 40K, where you have hundreds, if not thousands, of miniatures and dollars worth of the stuff that you're putting on the table. Or Dungeons and Dragons, where you've got all these hours and hours of prep that you've got to do, but then you have this amazing, immersive, imaginative experience. Then on the other side, you have video games, which can be this very solitary experience where you can play just on your own, or you can be solitary with friends by playing online. Like, I know, Brian, you and I were playing Necropolis last night, which was great because we're, an hour and a half away, and we were able to connect and have a good time. But the world was created for us. We didn't have to imagine anything. We kind of got to play inside of the realm of that event. Board games are the sweet spot where it is a collective experience that you get to share with people around a table, all looking at each other, especially since split-screen gaming has kind of died off over the last decade. I mean, there are some games that have it, but it has died off a bit more. And instead, board games have taken over that because now we're all around the table. all sharing the same experience, we have a set of parameters and rules in a board game, usually a lot more than, say, the imaginative games or the war games, where imagination creates more spontaneous situations than video games do. So it's this great sweet spot. And do you guys agree with that?
I would agree with it. And I think part of that, just to go on what you're saying too, is in the case of video games turning into board games, a video game based on a board game like Doom or Portal, I think, has a board game out, things like that. It's that aspect of people that love these worlds and these settings in their game that they can play multi-single player through the TV and things, that want to kind of stay in that world or expand on that world and share it possibly with more people. And that's where a little bit extra of the allure of the board game to video gamers comes from, is, hey, I can now take this box of the Resident Evil card game, for example, just as the deck building game, can play in Resident Evil 4 or whatever. There's no Resident Evil games that come after that. We won't even bother with those. But play Resident Evil 4, and then I can grab 3 or 4 people, however many, and kind of expand on that and still stay in the setting that I love.
I think the rising resurgence of board games, I think that's kind of now become the new get everybody over your place to play video games, because now we have online multiplayer. There's no need for really split screen gaming anymore. So now there
is no split screen.
Yeah. So now board games are the new let's get everybody together for 8-player smash up or whatever have you. So, Reid, you just mentioned Resident Evil, which is how I was drawn into this whole mess. Thank you, Wyatt.
You're welcome.
So this was in 2011. This was PAX number 1 for us. And Wyatt had told me that there was a deck building game, which I had no idea what a deck building game was. To me, there were only 2 really major card games that were being played by everybody, it seemed, and that was Magic the Gathering, and that was a hell no for me.
The classic, the one that kind of started collectible card games, at least here in the U.S.
Magic the Gathering, which I knew has probably bankrupted many a bank account, many a person. And then, of course, you had the other ones. You had like the Pokemon card game and things like that. So I had, this was a strange and foreign concept, but because Resident Evil is one of my absolute favorite video game franchises, I'm like, I'll have a look at this. And, it incorporates elements from Resident Evil 1 through 5. And the rules are, for those of you out there, the rules are basically a carbon copy of the game Dominion, with a few little tweaks here and there. But
a few. They're massive tweaks, yeah.
A few. But, I mean, when I played Dominion years later, I'm like, oh, that's similar. I'm like, oh, I see. Oh, Resident Evil just kind of lifted most of this wholesale. Okay.
Yeah.
But
kind of, we always talk about grandfather games, like the games that started a genre. Dominion is the grandfather of the deck building game, where it gave you kind of the basic rules of where you're trying to buy out of a collective pot to make your own personal deck to be better at everyone else to complete an objective. And Resident Evil took that and added the new element of trying to break down the mansion doors and actually fight things rather than kind of just going around the table over and over, which has some really great, hilarious moments. It has some setbacks, but it's a take on Dominion, to be sure.
It definitely is, and I really liked the fact that the entire game was contained in that box. It wasn't like Magic, where you actually have to spend copious amounts of money to find and pray and hope that you get really good cards. Whereas the entire Resident Evil deck building game, expansions aside, you have the entire game in that box.
Well, that's what I was saying. I think that compactability and that fact that you don't have to have a giant money sink if you don't want to get a fully quantified experience in the game is a huge allure. Even though you have how many expansions for Resident Evil now?
All of them. There were 4. I have all of them.
That game is no longer producing, correct?
Correct. They stopped a few years ago, so we're not getting any more, and that's that.
Probably a good thing.
Probably, yes. So there's a game that was. So the allure to me there, Wyatt, was the fact that this was based on a franchise that I know and love. And I've been a fan of the Resident Evil series almost from the very beginning on PlayStation. So this had a definite appeal and allure to me, and I love this game. And it was from there, that was like the gateway game for me. And many dollars later, I now have shelves upon shelves of video games, and that still interests me, because as the board game, tabletop game scene has been growing over these last few years, a lot of it has its own little indie development area,
right,
if you will. I mean, it's because again, when a lot of people thought of board games, they think of the big companies, Hasbro, Parker Brothers, again, all those classic titles that we probably all played as kids at some point. But now you have whole sections of independent board game developers, much in the same way that you have a lot of indie video game developers, getting ideas and getting inspiration from video games. Another one that was introduced to me, I don't know if it was from you, Boss Monster. Was that another one that you took credit for?
That's probably one that I put on the map. No, yeah, because I brought it for PAX 2013, and we played it before we started. I remember this. Yeah, no, I had gotten the game. I remember bringing it to PAX in 2013 or 14 and playing it right before we started, because there wrote an article about it, so it was 14. It's 2014. Played it the night. And then I told you I had to get the game. The people that were rooming with me for that hotel told you how great the game was, and you were really surprised because you went to go get it, and it was sold out by the end of the second day. Like, every single place had sold out of it, and you were really surprised at how this thing was selling. You thought it was going to be this little niche kind of...
Yeah, that became the game to buy. That was the game. And for all the different vendors at PAX that were selling it, and the expansion, the Tools of Hero kind of expansion, they were sold out by the second. So I'm glad I made that purchase early, because I ended up, myself and Ben and my brother-in-law Ryan, we were playing that game all weekend.
It's a great small game. Like I said, it's a compact way that goes retro into video game history.
Yes.
It's not so much based on any one particular game per se, but it kind of takes homage, which is what I love. What's really great is that video games and board games are now in this weird situation where they're starting to try to figure out how they can work together and feed off of each other without vying for the same territory, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, they're not trampling on each other's turf.
And it's trying to figure out how can we get along, as it were, while still not causing issues. I remember... Maybe we should go around and figure out what the gateway games for people were that kind of got people back into board games in general. I know one for me was... One of the ones that first popped up was when I was running the Gaming Society. We were first the Video Game Society for the first year, and people wanted to start bringing in Magic the Gathering. We actually had a fight, me and Ben, because Ben thought bringing in Magic cards was going to be too nerdy, and we should just say video games because that was cooler, or something like that. It was more acceptable, and we were trying to make ourselves legitimate. We were trying to make ourselves have a budget for the first time. We did become just regular Gaming Society for the second year, and Magic was brought up, and we had people showing up then with chess, with Monopoly, with Sorry, and then Munchkin showed up, and that started changing the lines.
Which I have never played. I've never played Munchkin. That's
Steve Jackson is an interesting figure because he's a great figure because he kind of was one of the first people to kind of, I think, caught on to that people wanted card games and board games that were financially able to just be purchased as a one-off purchase and just be able to enjoy on their own without having all the rigmarole of like Magic the Gathering or Warhammer 40K. And so he made Munchkin, which is sort of, again, a predecessor to Boss Monster in some ways. You're trying to get to level 10.
I'd say Munchkin is more of a tongue-in-cheek kind of rendition of Boss Monster. Some of the same concepts, some of the same concepts from D&D, but there's a definite like tongue-in-cheek kind of satire to a lot of the environments that's out there. And it's funny that you bring it up, after having discussed with Game Society not wanting to be too nerdy for it, because I think in that respect, Munchkin, which was the huge game that a ton of my friends I had made before even coming to continuing college in New Paltz. When I first started going to college, that was the lunchtime activity for a bunch of us that were nerds from all different and geeks from all different backgrounds, because it made so much fun of the geek area, and I think that became a great gateway game in a lot of respects for that.
Oh, absolutely. I agree with you there. I remember that was the one that kind of I saw. I don't know if it was one that roped me in, but I know it's the one that really got a lot of people going, hey, maybe we can kind of have fun doing this.
And, I like the fact that it draws on the inspiration and can actually make fun of video games, because Boss Monster is a bit, a little bit more serious. I mean, it does definitely take its inspiration from the older 8-bit RPGs, older Final Fantasy, Dragon Warrior, Gauntlet.
Right. Yeah, the 8-bit era, gaming barrage that it has enough of the ode to and enough of like a nod and a wink to without being necessarily like a satire of, just in a, hey, remember back in this day? Remember when big boss battles basically encompassed fighting a giant freaking pig monster with tusks, as opposed to the boss monsters we have video games now. So Boss Monster is a great allure to the old-time gamers, whereas something like Munchkin, for example, is just an allure to geek culture, while at the same time being like, haha, we're ridiculous, but we're geeks.
And unlike most video games, in Boss Monster, you actually play as the boss monster rather than the heroes. You're trying to actually kill the heroes as they venture into your dungeon, which is a nice flipping of the roles.
I think one of the other games that finally got me back into board games was Heroescape. Does anyone remember that game?
God, I hated that game.
I've heard of it, never played it.
Why do you hate that game?
Oh, I absolutely hated it. One of my buddies got into it. A video game geek, that Magic player geek, was not a huge tabletop or miniatures geek. Having come from a background where I went from, I already said, I kind of started with BattleTech and board game. That got me into Warhammer. I was in that miniature table battle type mindset. Heroescape came along. I wanted to still be in that mindset, and the game I just found was a little too constraining, tried a little too hard to kind of bridge the gap of board game and more traditional, well, what was becoming traditional at the time, tabletop miniatures war game.
Okay. And
it didn't translate well for me. I respect it for what it was. There's a lot of kids that enjoyed it, and it was a good family game, things of that nature. But from like the actual mechanics wise of it, I couldn't even get my head around it. And
okay, so granted, when I say gateway games, they don't always have to be good, to be quite honest. It was just sort of the game that kind of let you know that, hey, board games are now a thing again. So like Munchkin is something that I have not played since 2007, I think, or 2008, because I found it was a grandfather game that kind of brought back the get around the table, tongue-in-cheek, try to be competitive while all working out around the same cards. sort of game, but it was flawed in some ways because you could end up having what you're trying to do is get everyone up to level 10. The person at level 10 wins, and you can work to fight monsters with each other. Very much. You can say, hey, Reid, I'm going to fight this thing. If you help me, you'll get a level, I'll get a level, you'll get a treasure, I'll get a treasure. But then you try to backstab people by using ridiculous items. And this game could go on forever, right? I'm sure you're experienced with that.
Oh, no, definitely. We had so many times where it would get to the point that it became formulaic with the backstab and the dealing that three or four turns from the end, you could tell who was going to win just because of the way the game went.
Exactly.
And over
so,
time,
the game went really, really well. It was a great game that caused a lot of laughter and fun. But I eventually had to stop playing it because I knew people that would refuse to come to the gaming club if it was going to be played because they had really bad experiences of being backstabbed and they started taking it seriously or too seriously. It had issues. HeroScape was a game that I was into at the time because I didn't have money, and I had played Warhammer 40k in high school a little bit, but I didn't have the money to start collecting my own giant sets. So it was kind of a way for me to enjoy miniatures gaming without having to spend a lot of money. Now, that game was flawed in some ways, to be sure. Tried to be too constrained and didn't know where to start or begin in some cases. So, again, that's not a game I'm going to play again, but I'm still thankful that it kind of sucked me back in. I know the game that I think that really finally got me to start collecting board games for myself was Summoner Wars. I played that at PAX 2010. I was able to go for one day for like 5 or 6 hours, and I walked by Plaid Hat Games, which is now a really well-known company for board games, and they had just released Summoner Wars, and I got to sit down with one of the developers, and they said, hey, you want me to teach you how to play? And I played as the dwarves, and I loved it. I was able to walk away with 4 different factions, quote unquote, for under $50. And that was a game that showed me that board games could be fun. They could be balanced, that game design was really getting better really, really quickly in board games. I don't think that's changed at all since 2010. It's just gotten better and better over these years. But it was also something that was a little bit closer to home. I could open up this very small box and play with you, Reid, or Brian. I could just bring it over in my bag because it was a very small box I had to carry this game in.
And even then, I'm looking at the game now. It looks like it again takes its cues from the older games. I could definitely see where it could pick up from D&D,
right?
And it probably was itself inspired by other board games as well. It sounds like it's got a pretty heavy strategy component like Risk. Looking at the description.
Well, what it was a game where you kind of had a board that you were able to either fold out from a paper mat or you could get a neoprene mat now. And it had squares on it like chess would, but you only used cards. And the cards were things that you would use to summon, like in Magic the Gathering, but you'd put them down onto a grid and you would play off each other. You didn't have to collect them because each faction was literally only... When you would buy one of the 2 starter boxes, it came with 2 factions. So if you got the different starter boxes, you could collect different factions. They eventually grew, so you would get one large box, and it would come with like 8 factions in it at a time. So it wasn't just you getting orcs versus humans. It could be orcs versus fire elves versus goblins out of the sand waste versus dwarves from deep underground, and each one had its own theme. They're able to expand on this game. They're still expanding on it 5 years later, where now they do have it where you can buy a second deck for one of the factions and then interchange those cards in and out. But again, it all fits into one box. Maybe 2 now, but you get the idea.
Yeah, we get it.
Well, but that's, even if it fits in 2 boxes, so you have that option of, you can grow and continue with it. You don't... I mean, let me ask you, did you feel back at the time compelled that, I have, just to keep up with this game, I have to continually buy into it, whether it's in the world of miniature gaming, I have to buy the newest models that are coming out, or the biggest model, or even tying it back to video games with downloadable contents now, to get the most out of this game, I need to buy this expansion. I need to, as opposed to the expansion could be fun.
I need the thing. I did a little bit. I mean, but I could stop whenever I wanted. That sounds like an addict.
It's a minor compulsion. I can deal with it if I want to.
This is really your intervention. This whole episode.
Oh,
sure.
Yeah, it's a trap. What it was I was able to buy. I bought 2 of the starter boxes, so I had 4 different factions, and then I could buy individual factions for I think like $8 a piece. But then I would add them to the set. So I think eventually, by the time I finished buying the game, I had about 10 different factions because they came out with a master box, which was like 8 factions for $40 or $50. And then once I was done with the game, it was all in one collective box, and I actually re-gifted it to John, who was getting into board games for the first time. And he didn't have, a lot of space. He was still in the dorms. And I thought, hey, this is a great game that makes me like miniature games. You'll probably like it. It's a great kind of starter into the hobby. And I know that he loves it. He still owns it. So I was able to give it up, actually. I do not need an intervention, I swear.
That's what they always say. Now, isn't there a Summoner Wars PC game? Or a video game?
Now, I mean, this is where I think we're going to try to get into the topic that Brian wants to, which is the collusion that's starting to happen, where video games are feeding off of board games and board games are feeding off of video games. So they made a iPad-friendly game. I think you can also play it on the any iOS, where you could buy a faction for like $2, I think, or get all of them for $8. You have very cheap prices, and you were able to play online. And Plaidhead Games helped, bring it, or they gave their approval, as it were. And when they did, I think they've actually hosted tournaments online for the game.
Cool.
Interesting.
Boss Monster was recently brought to Steam, wasn't it?
Yes, it was. I have it.
And how is it compared to the experience? How is playing Boss Monster the video game for you, Brian? Compared to the experience of playing Boss Monster, the tabletop game with a couple friends.
Well, since I've only played Boss Monster on Steam as single player against the computer, you do not get really the thrill that you get when you backstab somebody.
Twist the blade.
Yeah, there's none of that whole, because in Boss Monster, you could have another player going through and la la la, and gets through one room, gets to another, and if you have a spell just waiting, be like, nope, back to the beginning of the dungeon you go. Or something like that. I will say this though for Boss Monster, because something that's a little bit of it can be an issue with board games, especially with all these new ones, is how the rules are worded. And when you see what I was seeing in Boss Monster, the video game, now you see how the rules make sense. It's like, oh, I was misreading that rule wrong the entire time. I get it now. So for that, it's been a good experience. But, the video game is fun, and when you get to see it on the screen like that, it's like, the presentation's pretty cool because they use all the exact same art that's in the actual card game. So
now, if you had the option on a day like today, where it's cold, winter has finally arrived, there's snow, slush, it's a miserable day to really go anyplace. If you had the option of A, firing up and playing Boss Monster on your computer, or B, summoning through mystical portal, so nobody had to drive type of thing, a few people over to play Boss Monster around your kitchen table, which you think you would go more for?
I would want to have friends over. I like people.
You're no gamer. You're not antisocial enough.
You're supposed to be sitting in your mother's basement getting fat on Cheetos and Mountain Dew, damn it.
Damn right. But I think that's one of the other big allures of and resurgence of tabletop games that we kind of touched on a bit earlier. But, as video games are decreasing in split screens and being able to have your buddy down the road over to sit in front of the TV and play, because we're mobile, but we're more disconnected with net play and stuff on Xbox, PlayStation. Just getting that allure of having some people around to have that camaraderie and everything while you're throwing cards or dice or whatever down on the table. I think that's one of the huge lures, and that's why we're seeing the success of more video games getting board gameized or having some sort of tabletop edition forming. That it's just bringing people together more after, online gaming is supposedly brought people together more. I don't think we'll ever decrease the allure of being able to sit in real time with people and be able to play.
I certainly agree with that sentiment. I mean, for some board games, that still takes its cue from video games. I mean, that interaction is sort of essential. You have a game like Pixel Glory, where, again, very, very heavily inspired by the old 8-bit RPGs, where, it's a two-phase game, where in the first phase, you are communally trying to get the best spells, the best items, things to go take on monsters with, because you all play as wizards in Pixel Glory. And then you have the second phase. Now all bets are off. You're not friends anymore. Now you're trying to kill these various monsters, but the catch is the one that deals the fatal blow gets the points. They get the credit. So now it becomes a bit of, do I weaken this monster only to have another player use a powerful spell and take all the glory? Or do I sit and bide my time? And a whole bunch of strategy comes into play. And then you have a game like Super Dungeon Explorer, which I have only played once. Wyatt subjected me to Super Dungeon Explorer once, and immediately Gauntlet was in my head.
Yeah, so I wanted to bring this one up. So before we started recording this, I was actually a little bit surprised you were taking the angle you were, which is video games turning into board games, not the other way around. But if you type in video games that have been turned into board games, there's actually a rather famous list which has started, which is things like Portal was just turned into a uncooperative cake acquisition game, Batman Arkham City, Bioshock Infinite actually got a game, Gears of War got a game, XCOM was turned into a board game, StarCraft was both I think there's a Risk StarCraft, and there's a StarCraft board game on its own, the Resident Evil deck building game. So, there's some large franchises. Doom was just turned into a board game. And, these have been very large, very fancy productions which have started to have happen.
Metal Gear Solid Risk,
where people are taking the IP of the video game and kind of imposing it either onto a game that's already existed like Risk, or ones where they do a $60, $70, $80 box with miniatures, with all the branding on it. And a lot of these games have become really, really good. One that I know is very famous for is Civilization, which is a video game that was started in the 80s and was considered to be one of the first adult video games in the fact that it was very, it was very thinky. It played a little bit like a board game. And then it became very lauded because when it was turned back into a board game, people loved it. The games that we've been talking about, with the exception of the Resident Evil deck building game, is a lot of the ones we're talking about are board games that were inspired by video games. So, like Boss Monster or Pixel Glory, which were based off of 8-bit retro, good old times. The one that I love, and I have used many times to sucker people into the world of board games, is Super Dungeon Explorer. And I'm sure Reid has a story or two about that too.
Oh yeah, there's been some great games in that, and I think that's a great example of a game that isn't based on any one video game out there. It's not a Portal board game, it's not a Doom board game. It's its own thing, but it has enough similarities to a video game, like you said, that Gauntlet is the one that comes closest to mind, and likes to play off that with the very system that it runs. That just a few of the times sitting around playing that with a few other people. It felt like good old-fashioned sitting in an arcade trying to beat this level or beat this boss in Ninja Turtles or some type of multiplayer beat-em-up game. But here we were with no electricity needed, having a good time around the table.
Yeah, and, it was... Again, I've only played this once, and I have wanted it ever since. And...
Well, I can assure you, number one, you never have to buy it, because I have enough damn expansions, and I need to play it. So, at some point I have to have you come down here, not for Dungeons & Dragons or video games, but actually just you and me playing board games with no set schedule.
Right.
To be sure. For those that don't know, Super Dungeon Explorer is a game that was made by... It was originally Cool Mini or Not, but they've branched off, and now they're Soda Pop Miniatures, also known as Ninja Division. And they've made a game starting back in 2011 is when I played the demo of it. They were just starting to release the miniatures for painting. It's a miniatures-based board game. So when you buy this board game, it's like $80 to $100. But it comes well sculpted. And it's a mixture of, I'm going to say, Gauntlet Legends mixed with really hilarious anime tropes, because all the miniatures are very chibi, and you choose a hero each. So you're usually going to be playing with 4 people. 3 of them become the heroes, and then the final person becomes the Dark Council and runs the dungeon, as it were. And there's spawning points where you're spawning lots of these monsters. The original box, it was kobolds, and if they got through all the spawning points, they'd summon a dragon, have to fight a very large dragon. Another one, they actually made an expansion which was Mario-themed. They actually had Koopas that if you killed them, they turned into shells that you could kick around the board to attack people with. There was a lot of kind of tongue-in-cheek to some retro games. When things would level up, they called it going from 8-bit to 16-bit to super mode for some things. When you would hit things, they would say that hearts and potions would pop out of them, just like they would in the video games where you'd kill a monster. And, oh, hey, look, a healing potion was somehow in its spleen. Like it was very tongue-in-cheek in that sense. And it had a lot of fun with it. And I still have a blast playing it. I don't get it to the table enough because the game can take a while. But one of my favorite games was actually, it was just me and Reid. I played as the Dark Council, and I gave him the entire hero team to play. It was just back and forth. And I think we played 2 rounds of it. And it was a blast. It was an absolute blast.
All that is missing was your narrator for that game going, wizard needs food badly.
Blue wizard is about to die.
Yeah, it sounds like that also, since I've played the original Super Dungeon Explorer. That was the one you showed me. I've not played its later incarnations. So the fact that it's got, those references to things like Mario, I'm like, okay, so now they took that game, took a little bit from Gauntlet, and now they've taken a little bit from the indie game Evoland, and just...
They've done a bit of everything,
yeah,
which can work very, very well. One of the great things about board games is that, one thing that's not great about board games is that when you try to patch a board game, you have to release a new edition.
Yes.
You can't just, patch it digitally, so that is a genuine drawback. However, what they've done is that they kind of came out with the Forgotten King expansion, which was it was an improvement on it, and now they're coming out with Super Dungeon Explorer Legends, which I think they're remaking into kind of second edition rules entirely, but they're also releasing a RPG element where when you make a character, you keep the character and you actually have a character sheet. So when you finish a dungeon, you can save the character and then move on with another one. And I'd love to do that with a group of friends at some point for obvious reasons.
That could be interesting.
That could be very, very interesting. All right.
But, the games keep evolving, just like in video games. And I would care to say, because people have been talking about this recently, that the board games have been enjoying a faster pace of improved game design more than video games. Because they've been able to experiment more. It's more indie game friendly for people to jump into in some ways. And there's just been a lot of very interesting developments where the games feel more cohesive and whole. That's one of the arguments that people have been using recently.
Yeah, I can agree with that. Alrighty, so we've had a good 45, 50 minutes of discussion, so that will wind down our first half. On our second half, we'll continue the discussion. We'll talk about what we've started to mention here in this first half, the sort of collusion of board game to video game and then back again, and get more into that as the two of them mate with each other. So you'll have some music, as is our custom, and we'll go off and have a quick round of Pixel Glory or Chrononauts or what have you. But you are listening to the season finale of Downloadable Content, talking about the relationship between video games and board games. We'll be back. Welcome back to our season finale of Downloadable Content, talking about video games and board games. We're all still here. None of us have gone down to the local game store with cash in hand.
I'm doing that right after this podcast, though.
Yeah. He's gonna brave,
buy all the board games.
6 to 8 inches of snow. We were left on a cliffhanger, though. We had to stop our game of Dead of Winter to cut back to recording this. So the things we do for you.
Barnes & Noble is only like a short half an hour ride away.
Yeah, I mean that's just. And I mentioned this. We talked about it right at the start that. Like I said, Barnes & Noble's game section keeps getting bigger and bigger and bigger every time I walk in there. Like, games, like, when this whole board game resurgence started a few years ago, yes, we started seeing more and more of these games show up on Amazon, in actual board game stores. Then we started seeing those same board games spill over into mainstream stores like B&N. Like, I walked into Barnes & Noble one day and I saw Smash up there and I went, wait, what? Aren't you a little out of place? Betrayal at House on the Hill.
There's always room for Smash.
I'm like, Betrayal at House on the Hill. Like, aren't you in the wrong store? But this is what we've got, and great. But yes, on this
Just wait until you can get a... Oop, I'm sorry.
On this second half, we're going to talk about the continued marriage of video games and board games. Sort of the whole, we have the board games that are sort of based on or inspired by video games, and then you have a video game based on the board game. So we have that whole sort of the producers sort of movie about a musical, about a movie, about a musical, and so on, perpetual loop. And then the universe caves in on itself, and we're all dead. So.
Well, as of right now, this morning before I had to shovel snow, I was playing Super Dungeon Tactics, which is a video game based on the board game, which was inspired by video games. So it just released. It's actually really good. It's got some bugs in it because they're still working it out. I think this is the first thing that Underbite Games has made, which is the video game company that's producing it. But it's pretty much Super Dungeon Explorer, and they gave it a campaign. And they made it so you're now playing on a kind of a grid-based system. So think Final Fantasy Tactics, but now make it adorable and simplify it down a bit. And it has kind of this great 8-bit retro-themed music. So if you want to get into turn-based games and you don't want to spend $100 on the board game for Super Dungeon Explorer, like Brian or Reid, they don't need to buy the game. I have the game. They can get this and kind of play on their own when they get a chance. It's just really weird how it has turned into a Ouroboros, like you said, Reid, in the first half.
Just feeding on itself in a infinite loop.
And that's
And this is. Oops, sorry.
Go on. I cut you off.
That's out now, Wyatt, or your beta?
No, it's out. It came out on the 14th, and so I've been playing it. I played it that night on my stream, and it was really, really fun. I actually had some people that mentioned how damn adorable the game is. Like when you pick people up and move them around the map, their feet dangle, they sway around. You put them down, they're back into miniatures. It's got a really great kind of poppy chiptune feel that makes it feel old-fashioned. The plot is a campaign that it kind of plays out with the talking faces with no voice acting, so it feels like an old-fashioned retro video game that was based on a board game that was based on a video game.
Well, yeah, look at that. And only $18 on Steam right now.
Yeah. I mean, you've had a lot of this happen on Steam in the last 2 years. They took some of the most famous board games, Catan, Ticket to Ride, all sort of the gateway board games, and they took those and digitized them. But again, that's sort of starting the loop. So now the question is, are we going to get a board game based off of the video game? Probably not, because the video game version of a board game is typically made so that way people can play either online with other people from far away, or as a way so you can play alone. So like right now, there's the Pathfinder adventure card game, which is a card game version of Pathfinder, the role-playing game, which is a lot of fun, but it's a massive box. You need a lot of people to set up and play it. They made a digital version of this, which you can play for free, or I think you can buy all of the downloadable content at once rather than having to like do it nickel and dime for like $20. And then you can play through the entire campaign as a video game on your phone or your iOS. But again, it's mostly done so that you can play on your own, and there's positive and negatives to both.
And I think that's partially why we're going to see, the flip side of video games getting turned into board games. Now we may see board games such as we have already mentioned, Super Boss Monster having a Steam version of the game, things of that nature, where I want to play this game, and maybe I want to play it with, Wyatt and Brian, and the fact that we're all half an hour to an hour apart from one another with potentially bad roads, things like that, makes it so doing the tabletop game isn't going to be as exciting. But, hey, still want to play the game, everybody's up for it. Everybody pops online, plays the virtual online version, a twist, whatever, of the tabletop game, and it helps satisfy that itch for the time being. So, like your Super Dungeon Explorer Tactics, the Steam Boss Monster, and a lot of even more traditional. I brought up Warhammer and like those type of miniature games earlier. There's been a lot more War Machines several years ago. Another big popular expensive collect and put miniatures together war game. had a digital, video game edition of it that had come out. Dawn of War in the Warhammer 40K universe of video games. Dawn of War 3 was just announced not too long ago as a popular video game version of the tabletop miniatures game. So you get this kind of loop of, hey, you have the options now of either throwing down physically on the table with all these bits and pieces you've collected for the game, or if that doesn't work for you, you've got a online version of that. And that has actually caused the creation of something called Vassal now, which from the description for Vassal, which is basically an open source board game simulator. It's a very small framework for a program that does exactly what it says. It simulates board games. You can go out and you download the main program, and then you download modules of it, and those modules will be anything from classic Monopoly, classic Risk, those untouchable classic versions of games that are simple and everybody knows and loves, to more recent versions of games, X-Wing miniatures as a sort of tabletop game. There's actually a Vassal version or a Vassal module for the Resident Evil deck building game.
Because of course there is.
Option. Because you can never have too much Resident Evil, unless they're the movies. But you can. So suddenly, here's this option, not in a commercial basis, but as a very simplified. And it's when I say very simplified, that's exactly what I mean. There's not graphical versions. There's not 3D rendered models of a character on a card. There's not a lot of pixels and shaders used. It's pretty much what you would see looking down at a board, or little almost cardboard cutout icons of what would be 3D models for things like Super Dungeon Explorer. But this was created, and again, it's open source, it's free. There's not a company that made it and is selling it. It got made because a group of gamers wanted to play traditional board games and didn't have a already established digital alternative to go to. And the community has just been building different modules to turn classic board games that may never see a video game version into a means of being able to play, connected with, even play multiplayer with other people throughout the world and as such on the computer.
That's very cool.
That's really fascinating concept.
Don't you just love the ingenuity of open source?
As a Linux user, yes, I do.
Well, yes. I think for you that's kind of out of necessity, but
Vassal is very bare bones, but then you can do anything you want with it. There's a one that's actually more of a coder, which is Tabletop Simulator. It's actually something that you can buy on Steam for like, I think, $20 or $30, and then it comes with 1 or 2 games for free, and then you can download sort of the source code that's already pre-rendered for a particular game, like Zombicide, where you can take, again, a very large miniatures-heavy game and turn it into something that you can play online with friends. It's a little bit more graphically powerful. Like, it actually makes it look like the board game itself when you're playing it. But that's just as an example. So again, we're having this weird circular thing. You bring up freaking Dawn of War, Warhammer 40K, and Warhammer from Games Workshop is, again, we're getting back into a grandfather of gaming. StarCraft was originally supposed to be a Warhammer game that, for reasons where they let it go, and then Blizzard decided to make their own independent project, took off on its own. But sort of that 80s-tastic world of Warhammer 40K, where everything has a gun on it, and space is terrible, and it's filled with monsters, and
Space Marines.
Yeah, Space Marines and everything else. As the miniatures game started to falter because of some bad decisions by the company, in my opinion, and they started to have issues with all of that, they turned to video games and kind of generated a video game franchise. Dawn of War is now huge, there's a lot of smaller games which are based off of the fantasy world, and as it keeps trying to expand and kind of rebuild itself. Again, it just kind of shows how it becomes very circular. I'm wondering when we're going to get a video game... Sorry, I'm wondering when we're going to get a board game version of Dawn of War, which was based off of a miniatures game. I'm wondering if that's ever going to happen.
I think we do have a couple, a few traditional board game style Warhammer 40k options now, and I think, I'm trying to remember the name of it, but there's a Warhammer, either it was Warhammer Horus Heresy called, or Warhammer Armageddon, something like that, which was basically there was a Horus Heresy game, which was a large-scale sort of takeover control, kind of the board game equivalent to an RTS, like Risk or so, take on the 40k universe. So that company has also branched out into having the Super Dungeon Explorer style and more traditional style board game attempts at some of its the games in its larger intellectual property.
Here's another one for you. Have either of you played the XCOM video game?
Oh, yes. XCOM is wonderful.
Okay. We have XCOM the board game, which not only is it based off of the video game XCOM, but in order to play the board game, you have to download a free companion app on your tablet or open in web browser.
Yes, you do. So I've not played this board game yet. The video game, if you don't know it, is a turn-based game, sort of like Final Fantasy Tactics. But when they came out with when they came out with XCOM Enemy Unknown back in 2011, I think, right, Reid? Or 12? It was kind of...
I would say 2012, I think.
Okay, yeah, 2012 sounds right.
The Enemy Unknown?
When it came... Yes, Enemy Unknown. When it came out, it was kind of lauded as taking the turn-based game and making it really cool and action-based again. Because as the characters moved, they'd run up and hide behind cover. When you would do the attack action, it would zoom in and do over-the-shoulder cameras of them shooting aliens. It added a really thumping soundtrack, so it made it very, very immersive. But this is a video game series that was made off of turn-based gameplay, so it played a little bit like a board game or miniatures game off the bat, and just made it really action-filled and powerful. They made a board game version of it, I think 2 years ago now. I think it was 2014 the board game first came out. I haven't played it yet, but I know people that have, and what happens is that there is a phase where you load up the app and you hit go. And this is called I believe it's called the action phase or the preparation phase. And what happens is that each one of the players is like the science officer or the security officer, or they choose a role on this team trying to defend the world from aliens. And during this, they're trying to do all of their actions, and you only have 2 minutes to say everything that your team is going to do cooperatively to fight the aliens. And during this time, the timer on the iPad starts throwing down challenges like, there's a fire in Spain. What are you going to do about it? Oh, there's a bad report of press about aliens getting out in America. What are you going to do about this? So it's throwing all these randomly generated threats at you through the iPad app that you have to respond to on top of what you're trying to do during this time section of the board game. So it gives it that freneticness that a video game can sometimes have.
That's a pretty cool mechanic. That sort of reminds me. Now I'm gonna age myself severely here.
Yes, you are.
Thank you. Do you remember? Maybe you played some of these as a kid. Maybe not. Like the board games that had a VHS cassette component to them, like Atmosphere.
I was never allowed to because they were too expensive for my family as a child, or they said it was too expensive, so I cannot speak one way or another for that one.
I hadn't played Atmosphere, but I had played a Star Trek game similar.
Okay, yep.
Just something with Klingons.
Something with Klingons.
Something with Klingons.
You won. It was something to do with Klingons. I remember there was Klingons yelling at you, and
I mean that's not surprising.
If you, it would. Well, it was, if you won and completed the game, basically you stopped the videotape before the actual end. If you lost, you continued the videotape to the end, where the Klingon just comes on and berates you for a couple minutes and explains how there's a worm that's used as a food source called a bra. I shall call you bra. And it was just like, what? But yeah, it was all board game based, and then you had VHS, which would tell you when rules changed or sections of the ship changed.
Yep. Well, it was called Atmosphere in this country. To the rest of the world, it was called Nightmare. And you basically had this guy that looks like death, and you had your main objective of the game, and you only had an hour to do it. And because, we have a VHS, if you play it enough times, when the guy appears on the screen and changes the rules, it became predictable after a while. But it was a ton of fun, and that's what the XCOM board game sort of reminds me of with this companion app. Although it sounds like that the iPad app, Wyatt, what happens is a little bit more randomized because it's not
right.
Because it's not a VHS. So. That was my little tangent back down memory lane.
Well, no, I mean that's the thing is that board games were sort of something that were able to be done before technology took over, and it's kind of really funny that now that technology is such a huge force that it's able to board games have been able to thrive again, if you know what I mean.
Well, there was board games that attempted to incorporate some of the current technology in. I remember very fondly one of the board games I used to love playing as a little kid was called Omega Virus. And you had this large plastic thing in the center with a speaker and a number pad. And the whole concept was that you were one of several people on this spaceship that was slowly getting taken over by this AI computer virus. And you had color-coded sections. Each room had a command, like a 3-digit code. So as you explored the ship to try and find the correct resources to basically vanquish the virus, you would go in, you would roll a dice, see how much you can move and things. You would move into the room, and then you would input the key command for the room, the 3 numbers in this little calculator-looking keypad in the center thing. And the voice actor for the Omega Virus would tell you, either nothing there, or you found this, you found that, things of that nature. And as time went by, there was an actual time frame to it. I want to say it was about half an hour, maybe 45 minutes, where as you got closer to the end, the virus is shutting down bits of the ship, or bits of the stations. There's blocks you can't go in, and it would make attacks against you. It was all done audio-based, but you couldn't play that game without having this center kind of stupid computer, by today's standards, sort of a device in the middle to basically dungeon master the experience for you.
It's really funny that you brought that up. My writer, Adam, when we did our board game recording episode, we did what were your first memories of playing board games, and he used that game as his example. So
nice.
Very funny. I thought you'd get a kick out of that.
And as I'm looking through, and I remember seeing this, I was actually in Toys R Us about a week ago because it's Christmas shopping, and there are small children in my life that I need to buy gifts for. Not mine, other people's. But, and I saw a Angry Birds board game. Because Angry Birds to me is kind of like what it is now as what Mario Brothers was in the late 80s and early 90s. Just everywhere. We've got frickin'... It
has gotten popular.
We've got frickin' fruit snacks based on Angry Birds. And I was curious, so I took a look at this Angry Birds board game, and it is basically a physical version of the video game. You actually assemble the the structures that the green pigs sit on, and you have your little Angry Birds, and you actually use a small little catapult to try to knock it down. And I'm like, to a 5-year-old, this is probably the most hilarious and fun idea ever. And even then, I was looking at it and going, I could waste a few hours doing that.
Well, yeah, it's popular for a reason.
I was just
look at how much.
Reid's like, I'm gonna go buy it right now.
I am. Dude, I just went on Amazon and bought everything Angry Birds related. No. I played Angry Birds once with the app. It was using for 10 minutes. I got bored.
Fair enough. But it's kind of unique now seeing not only how board games have just exploded in popularity. Go to any department store and you have whole walls just lined with them now. It's like what the hell are it's like you have Monopoly and Categories and Taboo and Perfection and all the games that I used to play, and now we have all of these newcomers. Although the Words with Friends board game, why is there no lawsuit?
You're not wrong.
Didn't we already do that? Wasn't there already a board game for Words with Friends? Can't think of the name.
What was it? Scrabble, something. I did. I was in Target and I saw that and I'm just like, why hasn't this been hit with 1 billion lawsuits?
Because if we call it something different, it means we're not ripping them off. We're just imitating.
If we're calling it something different and rearranging the score multipliers on the board.
Totally different game now. Totally different.
There's a couple other games I want to bring up before we bring this to an end, because you mentioned Wyatt, Gears of War, StarCraft. They all have board games. We brought up, and there was a Witcher board game. It was based on the video game series The Witcher.
Gwent, right?
Yes.
No, I think Wyatt's referring to the Witcher card game. There is actually a Witcher board game as well.
Okay, sorry, my mistake.
It's called the Witcher Adventure game. It's made by Fantasy Flight.
Fantasy Flight loves
Fantasy Flight.
Yeah, Fantasy Flight loves taking IPs and kind of giving it the polished treatment and making them fun. So
I seem to notice that, and I've never played the video game on which it's based. It's another one sitting in my Steam library, waiting for me to eventually play it. But apparently you can play as, one of the main characters. Everyone has their own unique style and whatnot. You brought up the BioShock game earlier, Wyatt, and I did not know that there was a board game based on BioShock.
BioShock Infinite Siege of Columbia, I think it's called.
Yeah, you're playing as the two factions from BioShock Infinite fighting against each other. I've never played it again myself because the retro stuff I don't mind interchanging back and forth, but oftentimes when I really like a AAA video game, I don't feel the need to buy it as a board game.
Really?
It's weird because other situations I don't mind transitioning like that at all. So sometimes I'm not sure why I make those judgments.
Yeah, because that just sounds like an interesting mindset. Like, is it too new, or you don't know if you don't feel that it translates well? I don't know, but
I think it has to do with the fact that if I bought BioShock Infinite, let's say only like a month or two after it was released, I'm gonna spend $50 on that video game. I'm gonna play through it. I'm gonna spend 30 or 40 hours kind of playing through the game. Well, if it's a single player like BioShock, maybe 20, but like really investing myself. And then for me to jump into it as a board game with other people, it's sort of like there's certain games I like to have as a single player kind of fun experience, and other games I like as multiplayer, I guess. Maybe that has something to do with it.
That's fair. I mean, I know you're the type of player that, when you play a video games, there are some games that once you finish them, you've had the experience, they're done, you don't want to touch them again. I'm the same way in some games. So, I mean, I can kind of see that. And other times, though, that when I see something like a board game that is based off of a very recent franchise or a very recent game, I can't help but immediately think cash grab.
I think that's also probably part of it, too.
I think so. I mean, part of it does come into marketing, and that's nothing new. I mean, there were tabletop versions of back in 1988, a Super Mario Bros. Tabletop game did come out trying to replicate some of the fun of the NES game, while still very simplified, because that's how, board games were at the time. But it's so you're always going to have those games that come out shortly around when a big movie is hyped. I mean, Christ, I remember there was a Lord of the Rings card game that came out about the times that the first of the Fellowship of the Ring came out, and that's, you never hear or see anything about that anymore. And the lure has worn off.
And we're talking about merchandising, and I think the poster child board game for merchandising is in fact Monopoly. You have umpteen billion different versions of Monopoly, because one of the great things about Monopoly is how it's so adaptable to pretty much any franchise.
Risk
and
is
soon
one of those
we'll have the Monopoly movie.
Yeah, I can only imagine how riveting a Monopoly movie would be. These big giant dice just come out. Big giant dice come out of the sky, and you land on Boardwalk. Oh, you owe me $2,000. There's a hotel on it. That's.
Is there going to be a cameo by Trump? I had the obligatory.
How dare you besmirch my podcast with that?
Shame on you, Wyatt.
Jerk!
Shame on you.
I managed to work it in. I managed to work in the political.
Oh. But, winding this down now. Now, gonna kill him. Winding this down now. It's just from our discussion that we've had now over the last almost 90 minutes or so, it seems that one of the questions that I had addressed in the intro was to see how well video games have made the translation to board games, and it certainly seems that just from our own collective experiences within the last 4 or 5 years, they seem to be probably one of the better sort of adaptations. Like, you see video games trying to go to movies or television, and it usually winds up being an abysmal failure with few exceptions. Whereas something like board games, it seems like it's a mostly seamless. Obviously, there are some problems in there, but it seems like the translation of a medium of being interactive translates well to board games, because there's still that sense of interactivity. You're not losing the entire experience, whereas you go from a video game like Resident Evil, which is heavily immersive, action-based, to a movie, and all you're doing is watching it. You don't have any control over your decisions at all. You are here's the movie, take it or leave it.
I think that's right. I think that it's weird because movies want to have a very, very specific narrative. And video games and board games also, they thrive off of you kind of making a narrative for yourself and imagining or kind of getting to choose your narrative in some ways. You have agency. And taking that agency away and putting it into a movie is rough in some ways, while making it so you get to still be the hero or the villain or whatever kind of role you want to be in a video game and translating that into a board game and back again. It makes more sense to do that. Now, of course, there's a lot of things that have to be done to make that work correctly, and sometimes the translation doesn't work entirely well. I know that sometimes when you try to take a very good board game and turn it into a video game, if you don't have the right technical components or the developer, it's just not going to work because it gets bogged down by interface, or there's too many rules in the board game that don't get translated automatically into the video game, or vice versa. But you still have that crux of what's at the end of what a game is, which is you're trying to give you as the player agency over what's happening and make you feel like you're part of the story.
No, I would agree with that. I think, with a board game, video game to board game, as opposed to video game to movie, you have, you're still part of that world. You're not just outside looking in. You're getting a chance to not only get immersed in what's there, but go beyond what the video game itself will provide to be able to explore a bit more with that world.
Yeah, I just think that's a really, really big part of it. It's the fact that, you lose what matters most in a video game when you make that transition. I mean, even with comic books and novelizations of video games, I mean, there's still that sort of emotional, I guess, attachment, but again, you're seeing something being presented to you. You don't have any control over the action, whereas with a video game to a board game, you still have an objective, you still have to make decisions, and they still will have an effect on the outcome. There is still an element of success or failure, for example. I think that was a very, very good discussion, gentlemen. So that is going to pretty much wrap things up for downloadable content for the year. So again, if you have any questions, comments on this episode or any other episode of downloadable content, or you want to, over the next couple of months, just binge listen all 123 episodes, you can do that on dlcpodcast.com. Every single episode is there. They're all on YouTube. They're all on iTunes. Again, probably beginning of 2017, I will be putting up the first block of recordings for the year, so be on the lookout for that. If you want to participate in any recording, you can also give us feedback, so it's all there. Let us know what you think. You can give us ideas for episodes. We like hearing from you. Feedback is good. We need validation.
Like me. I need someone to like me.
We're hungry for fame.
I bet nobody's gonna give me a single like or share.
There goes Reid with the guilt. There it goes. Employ the guilt. That works.
Huh?
Just to complain to the internet. You never call me. You never talk to me.
People would make me feel better if they went to Downloadable Content's Facebook site and liked it. Just saying.
And go to Sprites and Dice as well. Wyatt and Company put up a really, really good site. They stream all the time, it seems. It seems like there's a stream going on almost every other day. You guys are pretty active on there, so. And because this is the last episode for this year, I just want to thank everyone who has been on Downloadable Content this year. So thank you all for being on Downloadable Content this year. And of course, all it remains for me to do is to wish every one of you out there, hopefully you're having a good holiday. Enjoy your new year. We will be back in January, end of January, with the start of season 7 of Downloadable Content. So I hope you will listen to us then. With that, I am Brian. Have a good one, everyone.